The sky over northern France burned in the pale light of dawn. The winter sun, dim and distant through a haze of smoke, glinted off fragments of aluminum, tumbling slowly toward the earth. Below, thin trails of fire marked the long fall of aircraft that would never return. Above 20,000 feet, the air was sharp and thin, cold enough to freeze the moisture on a man's breath before it left his mask. Through that frozen emptiness came the roar of four engines, uneven, battered, defiant. A B-17 Flying Fortress, its olive-drab skin torn open in half a dozen places, struggled westward toward the English Channel. One engine was gone entirely, a blackened cylinder still smoldering. Another sputtered, coughing gray smoke. The right wing hung lower than it should have, the controls sluggish, heavy with damage. Inside the fuselage, the world was chaos and silence at once. The waist gunners spoke in fragments through the intercom, voices shaking in the oxygen mask microphones. The radio operator sat over his set, one hand bandaged, sending a steady beacon pulse that would guide the fortress home. In the tail, what had once been the gunner's station was a tangle of metal and shattered plexiglass. The seat was empty. The crew knew he wouldn't answer. German fighters circled at a distance, curious but cautious. They had already made their passes, raking the fortress from nose to tail. To their disbelief, the bomber still held formation, still returned fire with a single surviving gun. For the men of Jagdgeschwader 26, it was another encounter with the aircraft they had come to both fear and admire, the one they called Das Flugzeug, das nicht sterben will, the plane that would not die. From the ground, villagers in occupied France looked up and saw the crippled giant limping home. Its shadow moved slowly across the fields like a wounded animal refusing to fall. Pieces of insulation drifted down like snow. A single parachute opened behind it. One more crewman, who had chosen the long fall rather than the uncertain ride back over the channel. When the bomber finally crossed the French coast, the sea wind struck its damaged fuselage like a physical blow. The navigator, half conscious from frostbite, kept his eyes on the compass. The pilot, pale beneath his oxygen mask, coaxed the dying engines with minute movements of the throttle. The co-pilot read out altitudes that dropped steadily, a slow descent that could not be stopped. In England, radar operators of the 8th Air Force watched a single echo move slowly across the screen, separated from the returning formations. They knew what that meant. One plane out of 100 coming home alone. Yet more often than anyone expected, that single echo would reach the coast. The B-17 could lose half its control surfaces, an engine or two, entire sections of its tail, and still stay airborne. When the fortress finally appeared over the white cliffs, the ground crews ran from the dispersal huts to watch. It came in low, wobbling, its landing gear already down, flaps torn to ribbons. The left wing scraped the ground as it touched down. Sparks flared. A wheel collapsed, but somehow, impossibly, the bomber slid to a stop on the grass. Photographers arrived moments later, documenting the wreck before it could be repaired. In the photographs, later circulated through Allied press, you can count more than 1,000 bullet holes. One shell had passed directly through the radio operator's seat. Another had severed control cables that somehow reconnected themselves through sheer tension. The crew climbed out silently. Some wept, others simply stared back at the machine that had carried them home. One airman ran his hand along the fuselage and muttered half to himself, "She just wouldn't die." That phrase would echo across every airfield in England. Mechanics would repeat it while patching holes in aluminum skins. Pilots would whisper it before takeoff. And far across the channel, German fighter squadrons would use it with grudging respect, after watching bombers they had riddled with cannon fire continue to fly. In the dark winter of 1943, the legend of the Flying Fortress was no longer propaganda. It was lived reality on both sides of the war. A machine designed to carry 10 men through hell and somehow bring them back again. And so begins the story of the aircraft the Germans learned to fear, not because of its guns or its bombs, but because of something far more unnerving. It refused to die. The legend of the Flying Fortress began not in combat, but in a quiet competition held long before the world was at war. In August 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a simple request to American aircraft manufacturers. They wanted a new bomber. one that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs at least 2,000 miles and fly faster than any fighter in existence. It was an audacious specification for a nation still emerging from the Great Depression. At the time, most military aircraft were fragile, fabric-covered biplanes that still resembled the Great War's designs. To many engineers, the idea of a long-range, high-speed bomber seemed almost reckless, a dream out of proportion with the Army's modest budget. But at Boeing's Seattle plant, engineers led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells saw something different. They saw the future. Boeing's chief test pilot, Leslie Tower, described the concept as a battleship for the air. 4 engines, each more powerful than any single-engine fighter of the day. A sleek aluminum monoplane with retractable landing gear, a fully enclosed cockpit, and a wingspan that dwarfed anything in production. The prototype was designated Model 299. It first took to the sky on July 28, 1935, from Boeing Field. Witnesses on the ground described it as breathtaking, silent for a moment, then rising into the blue with the confidence of a bird of prey. Reporters immediately recognized that something revolutionary had been born. One of them, Richard Williams of the Seattle Times, wrote that it bristled with machine guns like a flying fortress. The name stuck. That phrase, flying fortress, was never part of the Army's official lexicon. It was pure journalism, but Boeing recognized its power instantly. The company patented the term and painted it proudly on the aircraft's nose. From that moment, the image of an indestructible bomber entered the American imagination. But reality nearly ended the dream before it began. On October 30th, 1935, tragedy struck. During a demonstration flight for Army officials at Wright Field in Ohio, the Model 299 crashed shortly after takeoff. A control lock had been left engaged. Test pilot Major Ployer Hill and Boeing's own Leslie Tower were killed. The sleek new aircraft burned in full view of horrified observers. In any normal year, that might have been the end of the project. The Army disqualified Boeing from the competition, awarding the contract instead to Douglas for its simpler, twin-engine B-18 Bolo. But a few officers saw beyond the disaster. They recognized that the accident wasn't a failure of design. It was human error, born of complexity. The airplane had simply outgrown the habits of aviation itself. In the months that followed, the surviving Boeing engineers refined the design into the YB-17, introducing a new concept to aviation: the pilot's checklist. Every pre-flight procedure, every control movement was now written down and verified by both crew members before takeoff. It was an innovation that would become universal in aviation and would save countless lives. Through the late 1930s, the Flying Fortress evolved through quiet, steady engineering work. The B-17B, C, and D models were built in small numbers, mostly for evaluation and training. The Army Air Corps was still hesitant, reluctant to fund a 4-engine aircraft when twin-engine designs were cheaper. But overseas, the world was changing fast. By 1939, German bombers were already darkening European skies. The Luftwaffe's Heinkels and Dorniers struck with precision and terror. Across the Atlantic, American military planners realized they would soon face a similar war, but fought at far greater distances. The United States needed a bomber that could fly thousands of miles over water, strike a target deep in enemy territory, and return without escort. That doctrine, the belief that the bomber will always get through, became the guiding philosophy of the Army Air Forces. The B-17 was built around that belief. It was designed not to evade attack, but to survive it. Its designers built strength into every spar, redundancy into every system. Hydraulic lines were duplicated, electrical networks divided into separate circuits. If one engine failed, 3 could still carry the load. If 2 were gone, a skilled pilot could still limp home. Inside, the crew positions were arranged like compartments of a ship, each serving a distinct function but connected by narrow tunnels of metal and canvas. The nose held the bombardier and navigator, surrounded by clear perspex panels that offered panoramic visibility. Above them, the pilot and co-pilot sat in an armored cockpit, instruments glowing faintly green under blackout lamps. Behind them stretched the narrow fuselage filled with gunners, radio equipment, and ammunition belts that snaked along the walls. Every man aboard had a job. Every gun had a field of fire. The idea was simple: A single B-17 could defend itself from any angle, and a formation of them, tight and disciplined, would be an airborne fortress city, guns covering one another in overlapping arcs of protection. It was an elegant, almost mathematical idea. Yet it would take war to test whether theory could survive contact with the enemy. By December 1941, when the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into global conflict, only a handful of B-17s existed in operational service. But within months, the factories at Boeing, Lockheed Vega, and Douglas roared into production. The assembly lines filled with the new B-17E model, faster, heavier, bristling with more guns than any bomber before it. Workers riveted the skins by the thousands, their hammers echoing across hangars from Seattle to Long Beach. To many of them, the Flying Fortress was more than a machine. It was a promise that American industry could build something so strong, so enduring, that it could turn the tide of a world already sinking into darkness. By 1942, the first of these fortresses crossed the Atlantic. They landed on damp English airfields carved from green farmland, where the air smelled of mud, oil, and the distant sea. The crews who would fly them were young, barely 20 years old, trained for months, now staring at the aircraft that would be both their weapon and their fragile home. None of them could know that within a year, the B-17 would become one of the most recognized silhouettes in the world, nor that its durability would soon become a legend even among those sworn to destroy it. By the summer of 1942, England had become a vast armed camp. Its fields were no longer quiet. Runways cut across the countryside like new scars, hangars rose beside hedgerows, and every sunrise brought the sound of engines warming beneath low gray skies. The men who filled those bases were strangers in strange land. Young Americans, fresh from training fields in Texas and Nebraska, now living among centuries-old villages that still bore bomb damage from the Blitz. They called themselves the 8th Air Force. To the British, they were the Yanks, polite but restless, bringing with them chewing gum, swing music, and a confidence that only distance could breed. Their aircraft gleamed under the thin English sun. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, still factory new, their olive paint unscarred. Each was adorned with a name and a nose art painting that reflected the humor, longing, and fear of the men who flew them. At first, the B-17 was an unknown quantity in the European war. The British had been bombing Germany by night, relying on darkness for safety. The Americans brought a different philosophy: precision daylight bombing. They believed that carefully aimed bombs, dropped from high altitude in formation, could cripple specific industrial targets, factories, rail hubs, oil depots, without the need for terror raids on cities. The theory depended entirely on one thing: that the Flying Fortress could survive in daylight against a determined enemy. The first missions would test that belief brutally. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group took off from Polebrook Airfield on the first American heavy bomber raid against occupied Europe. Their target was a railway yard at Rouen in northern France. British Spitfires provided escort part of the way, then turned back over the channel. For the rest of the journey, the fortresses flew alone. From the ground, civilians saw a sight unseen since the start of the war: great silver bombers moving in disciplined formation through the daylight sky, their contrails weaving white ribbons across the blue. The German defenders were caught off guard. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire too late. Bombs struck near the target, not perfectly, but close enough. 11 bombers returned safely to base. One turned back early with mechanical trouble. The operation was hailed as a success. American newspapers printed triumphant headlines: "Fortresses invade Europe." But within weeks, the optimism began to fade. Subsequent missions went deeper into occupied territory. German fighter squadrons were ready this time. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed to meet the bombers with devastating efficiency. Without long-range escort, the fortresses had to rely on their guns and on each other. The formations tightened until the wings of one bomber nearly overlapped the next. Each crewman's field of fire protected another aircraft beside him, creating the interlocking shield of metal and flame that American tacticians had envisioned years before. In those early battles, the fortress earned both its reputation and its price. A single mission to Lille in October 1942 cost the 97th Bomb Group 3 aircraft. Over Saint-Nazaire, anti-aircraft shells tore through formations, shredding aluminum skin like paper. In the space of minutes, bombers disappeared into clouds of black smoke and fire. Crews who survived described the air itself as solid with flak bursts, the sound like gravel hammering against steel drums. Yet through the losses, something remarkable became apparent. Even when they were hit, when wings were punctured, engines shot out, and fuselages torn open, many fortresses still made it home. Ground crews watched aircraft land with entire sections missing, rudders gone, elevator cables severed, fuel leaking from self-sealing tanks that had somehow held together. At Thurley Airfield, a B-17 limped back from a raid on submarine pens at Lorient, with one engine burning and another feathered. The tail gunner was dead, the radio operator wounded. Photographs show the tail nearly detached, held by a few twisted spars of metal. Yet it landed safely. When engineers examined the aircraft, one of them said simply, "They built these things to take it." Each returning fortress became a story. Crews gathered at mess halls and told of miraculous survivals. The aircraft that flew home with half a tail, the one that landed with 1,000 holes in its skin, or the bomber that came down with all 4 engines dead and still slid to a stop on its belly. The tales spread across the 8th Air Force, becoming legend faster than propaganda could print it. By the end of 1942, the fortresses had carried out dozens of raids. Losses were heavy, but morale remained strangely unbroken. For every bomber that failed to return, 2 or 3 came back so damaged that they should have fallen, and yet hadn't. Crews began to trust the machine as if it were alive. The British, initially skeptical of daylight raids, began to take notice. They had watched the Americans suffer, but they also saw what the Flying Fortress could endure. The Royal Air Force's own bomber command chief, Sir Arthur Harris, privately admitted admiration for the design, saying, "There's something almost unfair about that aircraft. It simply refuses to fall apart." By early 1943, the 8th Air Force had grown in strength. Dozens of new airfields dotted the English countryside, each home to a bomb group of young men who would fly into occupied Europe almost daily. Every mission meant hundreds of miles of exposure, hours spent under fire. The air war over Europe was becoming a battle of endurance. Machines against physics, willpower against fear. The B-17 would soon face its greatest test, not in skirmishes over France, but deep inside Germany itself, where the Luftwaffe waited in full strength. For now, though, as the fortresses taxied in at dusk, their engines cooling, the men climbed down from their battered machines and looked across the field toward the next day's horizon. They had survived. That was enough. And though they didn't yet know it, their survival was already shaping the legend the Germans would soon name with equal parts frustration and awe, the plane that wouldn't die. To understand why the Germans would come to call it the plane that wouldn't die, you have to see the B-17 not just as an aircraft, but as a philosophy made of metal. Every rivet, every beam, every inch of its skin reflected one obsession: survival. Boeing engineers had built the Flying Fortress as if they expected it to be shot at, constantly, brutally, without mercy. Its resilience was not an accident of design, but the result of 1,000 deliberate choices made by men who knew the physics of destruction. The heart of that resilience lay in its structure. Most bombers of the early war were designed like bridges with wings, simple trusses that bent or broke when overloaded. The B-17 was different. It used a semi-monocoque fuselage, where strength came not only from internal framing, but from its very skin. The aluminum alloy sheets, riveted in interlocking panels, carried the load evenly across the body. When bullets tore through one section, the surrounding metal absorbed the stress, preventing catastrophic collapse. Its wings were masterpieces of engineering. They ran as a single, uninterrupted piece through the lower fuselage, a design that distributed stress evenly across both sides. Each wing housed 2 engines, mounted wide apart for stability and redundancy. If one was hit, the aircraft could still fly on 3. Even on 2, sometimes 1, it could remain airborne long enough to cross the channel and reach the safety of English fields. The fuel system was built for the worst. The tanks were lined with layers of rubberized material that expanded when pierced, sealing small holes before fuel could ignite. Pilots joked that the tanks healed themselves, though in reality, the sealing process was just chemistry doing its quiet work. The same self-sealing principle was applied to oil lines and hydraulic systems, keeping pressure even when pipes were perforated by shrapnel. Armor protection was another key. Unlike many bombers of the time, the B-17 didn't try to shield every surface. Instead, engineers studied where crews were most likely to be hit: the pilot's seat, the navigator's table, the radio compartment, and the vital control cables that ran through the fuselage. Armor plates were placed there selectively, in layers only a few millimeters thick, but enough to deflect machine gun fire and fragments. Even the crew layout reflected survival thinking. Each position, nose, cockpit, radio room, waist, tail, was isolated by bulkheads. If one section was destroyed, fire and shrapnel could be contained, giving the rest of the crew a chance to fight on. The fortress was designed like a ship divided into watertight compartments, able to survive even when part of it was gone. And then there were the guns. 13 of them in total on the B-17G model. Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted in rotating turrets and flexible windows. The nose carried twin guns to protect the approach. The top and bottom had power-operated turrets that could cover nearly every angle of attack. Waist gunners defended the sides, their weapons mounted in open windows that froze with ice at high altitude. In the tail, a single gunner guarded the approach of pursuing fighters, often firing until his ammunition ran dry or his oxygen froze solid. Each gun position was like a fortress wall, overlapping with another. In formation, the effect was staggering. A German pilot attacking a group of fortresses faced not one bomber, but dozens of guns firing in concert. It was said that a formation of B-17s could put more lead in the air than a battleship broadside. Inside, the sound was deafening. Even through insulated helmets, crews could hear the thunder of engines reverberating through the fuselage. When the guns fired, the entire aircraft trembled. Shell casings clattered along the floor, rolling to the rear. The air filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder, oil, and burning insulation. Yet through it all, the fortress held together. Engineers had foreseen not just battle damage, but environmental extremes. At 25,000 feet, the temperature could drop to 60 degrees below zero. Hydraulic fluids thickened into syrup, oxygen lines froze, and frost formed on the inside of plexiglass windows. The B-17's electrical heating systems were primitive, but its metal frame withstood the cold without cracking, a detail that spared countless crews when other aircraft literally froze apart at altitude. Pilots described how the aircraft talked through its controls. The wheel grew heavy when damaged. The rudder pedals pulsed when the tail was hit. Yet the fortress remained flyable, even when control cables were half severed. Some crews reported returning with elevator cables completely cut, steering the bomber home only through engine thrust. Others landed without flaps or landing gear, the aircraft skidding down runways and still refusing to break apart. At maintenance depots, ground crews studied damaged bombers like doctors examining wounded soldiers. They took photographs, measured holes, and cataloged the injuries. Some fortresses came back with damage so extensive that engineers used them as living laboratories to understand what the structure could endure. One returned from Bremen with a 3-foot section of the wing missing. Another from Kiel had an entire horizontal stabilizer shot away. Both landed safely. It wasn't indestructible. No machine ever is. But what made the B-17 extraordinary was how predictably it survived the unpredictable. Its systems were so redundant, its structure so forgiving, that even catastrophic damage rarely meant instant death. It gave crews time. Time to think, time to react, time to live. And that, in the chaos of aerial warfare, was everything. To the Germans who fought it, the fortress's resilience seemed almost unnatural. Fighter pilots watched their shells explode against its fuselage, only to see the same aircraft still flying minutes later. They saw wings shredded, engines aflame, and yet the bombers kept formation, unmoved. Reports began to circulate through Luftwaffe units describing fortresses that fell apart in pieces but would not go down. In a war defined by machines, The B-17 blurred the line between metal and willpower. Its endurance seemed to mirror that of the men who flew it. Ordinary mechanics, clerks, and students turned airmen, trusting their lives to a design that refused to fail. Every flight into Germany would test that design further, each mission deeper, longer, deadlier than the last. And with every raid, more German pilots would look skyward in disbelief, watching bombers that should have fallen continue to climb. The engineers who built it had created something more than a machine. They had built a promise. The idea that even when torn and burning, it could still come home. From the German side of the channel, the first reports of the American bombers seemed almost unreal. Radar operators along the French coast watched the blips approach, steady, high, and unnervingly straight. They climbed higher than most aircraft could reach, then kept climbing. The interceptors scrambled, but even before the first visual contact, the Luftwaffe's radio networks were alive with disbelief. At 25,000 feet, the contrails appeared first, dozens of white threads drifting across the blue. Then, the bombers themselves, massive, slow-moving formations, their wings glittering with sunlight. German pilots were used to chasing single Spitfires or scattered British bombers at night. But this was something entirely new, an entire sky filled with aircraft that did not hide. The first to engage were veterans of the Channel Front. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 and 2, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109Gs and the new Focke-Wulf 190A. They climbed into the cold, thin air, weapons armed and throttles pushed to the stops. From their cockpits, the American formation looked like a flying city. Wehrmacht, they called them, short for Wehrmachtrig, four-engine bombers, a name that would become both technical term and curse. When the first German fighters dove into attack range, they discovered the truth behind the name Flying Fortress. The sky erupted with tracers. Dozens of white-hot lines converged from every direction, crossing and weaving like a net of fire. Each bomber was ringed with guns, machine guns that fired faster, longer, and farther than most Luftwaffe pilots expected. The first passes were devastating. Some German aces later recalled that attacking a B-17 formation felt like flying into a storm of steel. Their bullets struck home, but so did the Americans. The air between them filled with shrapnel, smoke, and empty shell casings tumbling toward the earth. Hans von Kornatzky, a Focke-Wulf pilot of Tiru, JG-26, described one of those first encounters. "We came in from the rear and above. I fired a full burst into one, saw flames, and thought it was finished. Then I looked again. It was still flying, still in formation. You could see daylight through the wings. I thought, how can that be? These things are monsters." Luftwaffe Command soon began to compile reports from squadrons across occupied Europe. Again and again, the same phrase appeared in different forms. Bomber heavily damaged but continued flight. Tail destroyed, aircraft maintained altitude. Multiple engine hits, bomber did not fall. For the German fighter pilots trained to strike quickly and retreat, this was a nightmare. A single hit could bring down most aircraft. But these American bombers seemed to absorb punishment beyond reason. Even when they caught fire, even when engines exploded, they held their course. Soon the Germans adapted their tactics. Instead of attacking from behind, they began head-on assaults, firing directly into the nose where the pilot and bombardier sat exposed. Others developed the Sturmbach approach, using heavily armored FW-190s fitted with 30mm cannons to smash through bomber formations with brute force. Even so, the casualties were shocking. Flying into the dense crossfire of the B-17s was like charging into a wall. Crews of returning fighters often found their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, oil lines cut, canopies shattered. The bomber crews, watching from their gun positions, began to notice a strange pattern. Sometimes, after a long burst from a tail gunner, the attacking fighter would suddenly break off and dive away, not trailing smoke, not hit fatally, but simply leaving the fight. Later, captured German pilots explained why. They called the fortresses unmöglich zu töten, impossible to kill. They fired until they ran out of ammunition, then left, convinced the aircraft could not be brought down without suicidal effort. Back at Luftwaffe bases in France and Holland, Mechanics began studying gun camera footage and reconnaissance photographs. They saw B-17s flying with massive structural damage, holes the size of doors in their fuselages, engines dangling, tails shredded, and yet they reached the channel every time. A report from JG-11 in late 1943 summarized the growing frustration. Repeated attacks by 30mm cannon have not produced expected results. Many bombers show extreme damage but continue flight. It is possible that the American four-engine type possesses a strength in construction unknown in our own designs. It was true. German aircraft of the era, like the Heinkel He-111 or Dornier Do 217, were designed for range and payload, not durability. They could not take what they inflicted. The B-17's layered structure, heavy armor, and self-sealing tanks made it an entirely new kind of target. In time, the name Flying Fortress crossed front lines. It became common in German intelligence documents and even among ground observers who learned to recognize the sound, four steady engines beating like a slow drum far above the clouds. A captured German officer later told Allied interrogators that his men began calling them Die fliegende Festung, Die nicht stirbt, the flying fortress that will not die. It was said with respect and with fear. The more the Luftwaffe fought them, the more they realized this was not merely an aircraft, it was an idea. A weapon that could not be deterred because even when crippled, it kept coming. The air war was turning into a contest of endurance. The Germans had skill, experience, and faster fighters, but the Americans had something else. A machine that refused to surrender to physics. And as the bombers pressed deeper into the Reich, that defiance would be tested again and again, at Schweinfurt, at Regensburg, and in the long, desperate months when the daylight skies of Europe became a battlefield without rest. By the summer of 1943, the daylight offensive had entered its most dangerous phase. The 8th Air Force had grown into a vast armada of men and machines. Every morning, the airfields of East Anglia shook beneath the roar of hundreds of engines. At dawn, the mist hung low over the runways as squadrons taxied into position, propellers throwing spray across the grass. Crews carried their gear in silence. Flak jackets, heated suits, parachutes, Lucky Charms, letters folded in pockets. They knew where they were going, and they knew how few might come back. The next target lay deep inside Germany, at the heart of its industrial empire, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Two cities bound by a single purpose. One built the Messerschmitt fighters that defended the Reich, the other produced the ball bearings that made all of Germany's war machines turn. Without ball bearings, engines would seize, wheels would lock, and production would grind to a halt. Destroy Schweinfurt, Allied planners reasoned, and the entire German war machine would slow to a crawl. But to reach it meant flying 600 miles into Germany, far beyond the range of fighter escort. It would be the longest, most dangerous mission the Flying Fortresses had ever faced. At 5:15 a.m. on August 17, 1943, more than 300 B-17s lifted off from English airfields. Their wingtips glittered in the rising sun as they climbed through the low fog and formed into massive combat boxes, three-dimensional formations designed to maximize overlapping gunfire. To an observer on the ground, they looked like moving fortresses of silver, block after block of bombers climbing into the thin blue above the clouds. The plan was ambitious. One force would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, continue south, and land in North Africa. A second, following hours later, would hit Schweinfurt and return to England. The two attacks, coming in sequence, would stretch German defenses to the breaking point. But from the start, nothing went as planned. Weather delays scattered the formations. Clouds and fog held back the second group for hours, giving the Luftwaffe time to regroup after the first wave passed. As the fortresses crossed into Germany, radar stations from the North Sea to Bavaria tracked them unbroken. Fighter groups scrambled from every airfield within reach. The first encounters came near Aachen. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose in waves, diving straight into the bomber formations from the front. Head-on attacks, deadly, deliberate, and devastating. Cannon shells ripped through the noses of the leading aircraft. Some bombers disintegrated instantly. Others held together, bleeding fuel and fire but refusing to fall. The sky over Germany became a vortex of metal. The contrails of the bombers twisted into knots, broken by black bursts of flak. Gunfire flickered like lightning across the formations. Gunners called out targets until their throats were raw, tracers cutting arcs through the air. For every German fighter destroyed, another appeared. Inside one B-17, the radio operator scrawled a single note on the log. Under attack for 1 hour, still going. At 9:42 a.m., the Regensburg force reached its target. Bombs fell in perfect pattern across the Messerschmitt works. The explosions sent rolling smoke columns thousands of feet into the air. Factories burned. Yet even as the bombardiers sighted their marks, fighters tore through the formation, raking the bombers from nose to tail. The return leg to North Africa was a gauntlet of attacks that lasted 300 miles. Of the 146 bombers that left England, only 122 made it to friendly airfields. Many landed in Africa on 2 engines, leaking oil, their hydraulic systems gone, their crews exhausted and bleeding. Hours later, the Schweinfurt force crossed the Rhine. The delay had doomed them. The Luftwaffe was ready, its squadrons rearmed and waiting. From Würzburg to the target city, the fortresses flew through a continuous storm of fire. Witnesses on the ground said it looked as though the sky itself was breaking apart. German civilians stood in doorways and watched bombers with flames pouring from their wings still hold formation. Some fell apart midair, their pieces scattering across the fields, but others impossibly kept flying. One German anti-aircraft commander later wrote in his diary, "They burn, they fall, they rise again. It is unnatural." The bombers pressed on to Schweinfurt, dropped their loads through the haze, and turned for home. Behind them, the city burned and the factories were in ruins. But the cost was beyond imagining. 60 bombers failed to return that day. 600 men missing, killed, or captured. Dozens more landed in England so badly damaged that they were scrapped on the spot. Yet for those who survived, the memory was not of the losses, but of what they had seen their aircraft endure. At Kimbolton, one B-17 named Fertile Myrtle returned with its tail section nearly severed. Only a narrow strip of metal held it together. The pilot had flown the last 200 miles on trim tabs alone. Another, Alice from Dallas, landed with a wing spar cracked in half, the left engine hanging by fuel lines. Both aircraft were written off, but they had made it back. Photographs from that day became icons of the air war. Black and white images of fortresses riddled with holes, their crews standing proudly beside them, grinning through exhaustion. Each hole told a story of near misses, of shells that had passed inches from men's hearts. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence officers reviewed the results. They had shot down 60 bombers, yes, but 160 had reached their targets, and nearly all of them had hit something of value. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were wrecked. Production fell by half. Within days, factories across Germany began reporting shortages of critical parts. The victory for the Germans was hollow. They had bled the 8th Air Force badly, but they had not stopped it. For the Americans, the cost was devastating, yet strangely, morale did not collapse. The mission proved that daylight precision bombing could reach even the deepest targets, and that the Flying Fortress could take the punishment and keep going. The air crews began to call the aircraft not just the Flying Fortress, but our guardian angel. In the weeks that followed, new missions struck again and again at the same cities. The names Schweinfurt and Regensburg became shorthand for endurance, the test every bomber crew had to face. German civilians began to notice something eerie in the pattern of raids. Even when formations broke apart, even when fire consumed their wings, there was always at least one bomber still moving forward. One observer described it in his letter home. "The Americans send machines that seem to live beyond their pilots. We shoot them, and they do not fall. They burn, they fly on." That was how the legend grew, among those who fought and those who simply watched from below. The plane that burned, but would not fall. And though the Schweinfurt raids cost hundreds of lives, they carved the B-17's reputation in steel and smoke. It was no longer just a machine of war. It was a symbol of persistence, the embodiment of an entire nation's belief that endurance itself could be a weapon. For the Luftwaffe, the realization was grim. Every time they believed they had destroyed the fortresses, more appeared. New groups filled the skies, fresh crews took the place of the fallen, and the same implacable formations returned to the same targets. From that summer onward, the Germans began to whisper the name with something between hatred and awe. Der fliegende Leichnam, the flying corpse, the plane that should have been dead long before it reached them. To understand what the Flying Fortress truly was, you have to step inside it, not as a diagram or a museum relic, but as it was at altitude, 25,000 feet above a frozen world. The moment the wheels left the runway in England, the B-17 became a different universe. Inside, the air grew thin and biting. The fuselage was unheated and unpressurized. The temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Metal touched bare skin like fire. Frost climbed the walls. The men's breath froze in their oxygen masks, forming small icicles that clinked when they moved. Each man aboard was alone, yet part of a machine greater than himself. The bomber carried 10 crew members, each with a specific role that could mean life or death for the others. At the front sat the bombardier, lying on his stomach in the clear plexiglass nose, surrounded by the endless blue and white of the upper atmosphere. Beneath him lay the open void, clouds far below like a solid floor of snow. When the bomb bay doors opened, the roar of wind filled the nose and the aircraft seemed to lift slightly, lighter by tons. Beside him, the navigator worked in constant half-darkness, his table covered with charts, pencils, and drift meters. His world was numbers, bearings, and timing, but his ears told him more than instruments ever could. He could sense through the rhythm of the engines when one was damaged, when the formation broke, or when the bombs fell. Just behind, the pilot and co-pilot sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the thick armored glass of the cockpit. Their hands gripped the twin control wheels, their feet steady on the rudder pedals. They flew not by sight, but by feel. The subtle vibration of the airframe, the pull of the formation, the way the fortress spoke through pressure and sound. When flak burst nearby, the concussion hit like a hammer. The cockpit lights flickered. Shrapnel clanged off the armor plate behind their seats. In the narrow catwalk below, the flight engineer crouched beside the top turret, his guns rotating above the fuselage like a watchful guardian. He kept one hand on the triggers and the other on the engine gauges, scanning constantly for oil pressure drops or fuel imbalance. He was part mechanic, part sentry, part gunner, a man who knew every sound his aircraft made. Further aft, the radio operator sat surrounded by static. His headphones carried the ghostly crackle of Morse code, the clipped voices of command, and sometimes the desperate calls of other bombers going down. His small compartment, barely larger than a closet, became the nerve center when the crew lost visual contact with others. In the chaos of combat, his signal could mean rescue or silence. Behind him, the waist gunners stood at open windows, each armed with a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on a flexible swivel. They fired from the hip, their bodies braced against the icy wind that tore through the gaps. Their world was noise and motion, the flash of tracer rounds, the brief silhouettes of enemy fighters streaking past, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling their lungs. Beneath them, in the belly of the aircraft, hung the most isolated man of all, the ball turret gunner. His turret was a glass bubble, barely large enough for him to curl inside, his knees against his chest, twin guns pointing outward. He had no room to move, no parachute, only his headset and a few inches of armor separating him from the sky. When the guns fired, the vibration shook his entire body. He looked down through his sights and saw the earth spinning slowly far below. It was said that a man in the ball turret lived in another world entirely, one of ice, vibration, and faith. At the very rear sat the tail gunner, sealed off in his small compartment of aluminum and glass. He faced backward, watching the contrails of his formation fade into the distance. It was a lonely place. He saw the fighters coming first, their black crosses growing larger by the second. He fired until the barrels glowed red, and sometimes he watched the fighters explode before they could reach him. Other times, he saw them pass so close that he could read the pilot's face before the flash. The noise inside the fortress never stopped. The engines drummed in a deep, unending rhythm. The guns cracked and stuttered. The oxygen hissed. The intercom crackled with clipped voices, short and calm, even in chaos. "Bandits, 9 o'clock low. Flak ahead. Hold formation." When a bomber was hit, the sound changed. A deep metallic thud reverberated through the fuselage, followed by the smell of burning oil. Shrapnel clanged off the armor plates, punctured the skin, and left thin trails of smoke curling upward. The crew moved without thinking. Fire extinguishers hissed, cables were cut, bleeding men were pulled to safety. They worked like one body with 10 minds, each connected by instinct and the hum of the engines. At that altitude, there was no room for fear, only procedure. The bombardier called his target, the pilot held steady, and the rest defended their fragile world of aluminum and oxygen. Every man knew that a single direct hit could end everything in an instant. And yet, day after day, they climbed back into the same frozen hell. After every mission, ground crews counted bullet holes. Some aircraft returned with more than 600. Others came back missing entire sections of skin, their framework exposed like bone beneath torn flesh. Inside the Risai, there were footprints frozen into the floor where crewmen had slipped in blood, the outlines still visible days later. But for every fortress that failed to return, there were others that came home on one engine, half wings, and sheer stubbornness. Crews began to talk about their aircraft as if they were living things, loyal companions that would fight to keep them alive. They gave them names like Knockout Dropper, Wee Willie, and Memphis Belle, each name carrying a personality, a defiance against the odds. To fly a B-17 was to live inside a paradox, to feel both immense power and utter fragility, surrounded by guns and armor, yet always one lucky shell away from oblivion. It was a world of courage lived minute by minute, mile by mile, through the endless cold sky. And while the fortresses carried bombs meant to destroy, the men inside learned something about endurance that machines alone could never explain. They learned how far the human will could stretch when encased in metal and driven through fire. At 25,000 feet, in the thin air between life and death, the Flying Fortress wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a home. A fragile, deafening, freezing, miraculous home. By late 1943, the German High Command understood that something had to change. The Flying Fortress was proving too resilient, too persistent. Day after day, the bombers came burning but unbroken, hammering the heart of the Reich's industry. The Luftwaffe could still inflict heavy losses, but never enough to stop them. Each time the skies cleared, the fortresses returned. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, called the situation a duel between courage and mathematics. Courage belonged to the pilots. Mathematics belonged to the factories that built the bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. To tip the balance, German engineers and tacticians began experimenting with new ways to kill what they now called Die Festung, Die nicht stirbt, the fortress that will not die. The first adaptation was tactical. Head-on attacks had proven deadly for both sides, but were still the most effective. A single 20mm or 30mm cannon shell into the nose could obliterate the pilot or detonate the bomb load. Fighters began forming up in large groups to dive straight into the formations, firing and then rolling beneath the bombers to escape return fire. The Focke-Wulf 190, already a formidable fighter, was modified for this brutal work. Its armor was thickened, its cannons upgraded, and its machine guns synchronized to fire in devastating bursts. The Luftwaffe created specialized Sturmgruppen, storm groups, whose pilots flew these heavily armored FW-190 A8R2 models directly into bomber formations, ignoring escort fighters and relying purely on shock assault. Their method was simple and terrifying. They formed up side by side, throttles open, and charged into the bombers' defensive boxes, guns blazing at near point-blank range. Some even carried explosive shells designed to break the aircraft apart in a single hit. A few pilots, desperate or fanatical, began ramming damaged fortresses that refused to fall. For a while it worked. In October 1943, during the second Schweinfurt raid, the Sturmgruppen cut through the 8th Air Force like a blade. 60 bombers were lost, hundreds of men killed or captured. The Luftwaffe celebrated what it believed was a turning point. But even that victory came at a cost. The heavily armored FW-190s were slower and less agile. Many were torn apart by the very defensive fire they charged into. German pilots began describing each attack as a one-way mission. Few survived more than 10 operations. The Luftwaffe also turned to technology. They experimented with air-to-air rockets, unguided projectiles like the Werfer Granite 21, mounted beneath the wings of fighters. The rockets could be fired from beyond the reach of the bombers' machine guns, bursting among the formations in massive shock waves. They were terrifying to witness but wildly inaccurate. Pilots complained that firing them felt like throwing stones into a hurricane. Even the Luftwaffe's new twin-engine heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt Me 410 and Bf-110G, were pressed into service as bomber destroyers. They carried 30mm and 37mm cannons capable of tearing through a B-17's fuselage with a single hit. But these aircraft were large, slow, and easy prey for the long-range escorts that soon began to appear. By early 1944, the Americans had a new answer to Germany's adaptation: the P-51 Mustang. Its long range and high speed meant that, for the first time, the bombers would not be alone. The Luftwaffe suddenly found itself under attack even before reaching the bomber formations. Still, the German fighter pilots fought with ferocity unmatched in any other theater. They developed new formations, new ammunition, and even new supercharged engines to reach higher altitudes. But it was never enough. No matter how many bombers they brought down, more appeared. No matter how many fires they started, the fortresses still flew through them. Luftwaffe ground crews watched through binoculars as burning B-17s disappeared into clouds, certain they had fallen, only to see them again minutes later, gliding westward, trailing smoke but steady. Hans Rudel, Germany's most decorated pilot, once wrote that fighting the American bombers was like fighting gravity itself. You could resist it, delay it, but you could never stop it. As 1944 began, the Luftwaffe's losses grew heavier with each battle. Fuel was scarce, pilots younger, experience thinner. Yet still the flying fortresses came. Relentless, methodical, each mission a hammer strike against the heart of Germany's industry. And the German people, who once watched them with curiosity, began to fear the sound of engines overhead. It was not just the bombs they feared, but the inevitability. The knowledge that no matter how many were shot down, tomorrow would bring more. The Flying Fortress had turned from a machine into a symbol of inevitability, a weapon powered as much by industry and determination as by aviation fuel. And now, as the bombers pushed deeper into the Reich than ever before, a new force would rise to meet them, one that would finally shift the balance of the air war and bring the sky itself under Allied control. By early 1944, the daylight war over Europe was balanced on a knife's edge. The B-17s had proven their resilience beyond question, but resilience alone couldn't win a war. Losses were still catastrophic. Every deep strike into Germany cost dozens of bombers and hundreds of men. Crews began calling it the long odds, the quiet calculation every man made before each mission, knowing how many didn't return. For months, the fortresses had flown alone. But now, from the airfields of southern England, a new sound joined the morning chorus: the high, sharp growl of the North American P-51 Mustang. It was sleek where the fortress was heavy, fast where it was steady. Yet the bond between them would change the course of the war. The P-51 was born out of desperation and perfected by collaboration. Designed by North American Aviation, it gained its true power only when fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and go farther than any Allied fighter before it. With drop tanks fitted beneath its wings, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The first time the Mustangs appeared alongside the B-17 formations, the men in the bombers hardly believed their eyes. They had been told for months that no fighter could accompany them deep into Germany. Yet here they were, sleek silver shapes darting through the contrails, weaving in and out of the formations like protective hawks. The effect on morale was immediate. Gunners who once watched the horizon in silence now cheered over the intercom when the Mustangs appeared. Crews began calling them little friends. For the Luftwaffe, their arrival was a shock. German fighter units that had once attacked with impunity now found themselves ambushed from above. The Mustangs dove through the formations at incredible speed, guns blazing, scattering the interceptors before they could organize. On February 20th, 1944, the Americans launched what they called Big Week, a series of massive raids targeting Germany's aircraft factories, and airfields. For 6 days, the sky above Europe was never quiet. More than 3,000 sorties of B-17s and B-24s thundered across the continent, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and now increasingly, P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe fought back fiercely, but it was a losing battle. For the first time, the bombers reached their targets in daylight without suffering annihilation. Factories in Leipzig, Augsburg, and Gotha were left in ruins. German aircraft production plummeted. General Galland described it bluntly: "We lost control of the air during Big Week." The fortress had finally found its missing half. The combination of endurance and protection made the daylight bombing campaign unstoppable. The German fighter arm, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, began to collapse under the relentless pressure. With the escorts clearing the skies, the fortresses could now strike deep into the heart of the Reich. Munich, Hamburg, even Berlin itself. The raids that followed were larger, deadlier, and more precise. The German capital, once thought untouchable in daylight, now echoed with the sound of American engines every few days. For the men in the bombers, the fear never vanished, but it changed shape. They no longer fought surrounded by enemies on all sides. Now they flew with confidence, knowing that somewhere above the Mustangs were hunting the hunters. The partnership between the two aircraft was almost poetic. The B-17, slow and deliberate, was the anvil. The P-51, swift and lethal, the hammer. Together they broke the back of German air defense. By the spring of 1944, Allied air superiority was complete. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies over its own homeland. Its fuel reserves were dwindling, its pilots inexperienced, its airfields under constant attack. And yet, even as the German fighter arm withered, the bombers kept coming, now in numbers that darkened the sky. From below, German civilians began to describe the sight as apocalyptic. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of fortresses flying in perfect formation, flanked by gleaming fighters, sunlight flashing from wings that stretched from horizon to horizon. The hum of engines became the soundtrack of a nation under siege. For the Americans, it was vindication. Years of loss and sacrifice had led to this moment. The point when the fortress could finally fulfill the purpose it had been built for: to go anywhere, strike anywhere, and come home again. The long war in the air had turned. The Flying Fortress was no longer merely surviving. It was winning. By the middle of 1944, the Flying Fortress had become more than an aircraft. It had become a symbol of endurance, of inevitability, and of a kind of mechanical immortality that unsettled even those who faced it from the ground. For the German people, the sound of the fortresses came before the bombs themselves. It started as a faint hum, low and distant, a vibration that seemed to come from the very air. Then, slowly, it grew, until the sky trembled with the roar of hundreds of engines. Those who lived through it described the noise as a living thing, a single deep note that filled the world. Children learned to count the seconds between the first hum and the wail of air raid sirens. Elderly men looked upward and murmured that the Americans were coming again. And every time, the bombers came in their perfect, disciplined formations, flying straight into the black clouds of flak as if they were immune to death. In propaganda films and newsreels, the German Ministry of Information tried to downplay the raids. The official tone was confident. The Reich's defenses are strong. The enemy's losses are heavy. Their raids are futile. But among soldiers and civilians alike, a different sentiment spread. The fortresses, they said, were unnatural, too strong, too calm, too constant. In some towns, locals began calling them Eisenengel, Iron Angels. Others said they were Himmelsungeheuer, monsters of the sky. Even Luftwaffe pilots, hardened veterans of years in combat, spoke with grudging awe about the aircraft that refused to fall. Psychologically, the B-17 was doing what no single bomb ever could. It was breaking the enemy's sense of control. The precision of the raids, the endless rhythm of daylight attacks, and the sight of crippled bombers still making it home created the impression that the Americans had found a weapon that transcended the limits of men and machines. Inside Germany's command centers, morale reports began to reflect the new reality. Civil defense officers wrote that civilians no longer reacted with panic to the raids, they reacted with resignation. There was no longer any question of if the bombers would come, only when. And in England, the legend grew just as powerfully, but in reverse. Each battered fortress that returned from the Reich became a rallying point. Crews would gather around the aircraft still steaming from flight, its fuselage riddled with holes, its engines coughing smoke. They would touch the torn metal as though it were alive, whispering words of gratitude or disbelief. Photographers captured the moments. Newspapers ran headlines that told of miraculous survivals, bombers landing with wings half gone, engines missing, or tails held together by sheer luck. The public saw the images and began to believe that the Flying Fortress was something sacred, a machine protected by destiny. American war correspondents, writing from airfields across Britain, began using language that bordered on myth. "The Flying Fortress," wrote Ernie Pyle, "is the closest thing to a living being that a machine can be." For the men who flew them, the mythology was both comfort and burden. It made them feel invincible, but it also reminded them of what was at stake. The B-17 had become the public face of the air war. Every victory, every loss, every burned fuselage photographed in newspapers back home. When a crew failed to return, their absence was felt not only on the flight line, but across entire towns in America. Mothers and wives followed the missions in silence, reading between the lines of official reports. Heavy resistance meant death. Some aircraft failed to return meant heartbreak. The myth of the plane that wouldn't die became, in part, a way to make sense of the terrible arithmetic of war. Each surviving bomber carried the hope of hundreds of others. Each mission completed became proof that courage and craftsmanship could defy gravity, steel, and fate itself. To the Luftwaffe, that mythology became a weapon in its own right. German pilots began to feel the strain of endless combat against enemies who never seemed to weaken. They spoke of the Americans as machines. Mechanical men flying mechanical beasts, unstoppable and without emotion. It wasn't true, but perception was enough. By late 1944, the Flying Fortress existed on two levels. In the air, it was a weapon, a formation of aluminum and gunfire. On the ground, it had become an idea, an emblem of a war that could not be turned back, a symbol of an industrial tide too vast to resist. And in both the American and German imagination, it took on something almost supernatural. To the Americans, it was the protector. To the Germans, it was the executioner. To both, it was a reminder that war had entered a new age, one fought not only with weapons, but with belief. As the skies over Europe filled with the thunder of Allied engines, the Flying Fortress was no longer the only giant in the air. Alongside it flew another bomber, equally vital to the Allied cause, but often overshadowed by the legend of the B-17. It was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, faster, longer ranged, and capable of carrying a heavier load. On paper, the Liberator seemed superior. It could fly hundreds of miles farther, cruise at higher speeds, and deliver more bombs. Its wing, a narrow, high-aspect structure called the Davis wing, gave it remarkable efficiency and range. Yet despite all these advantages, it was the B-17 that became immortal in the public imagination. The reason was simple. The Fortress brought its crews home. The B-24 was a remarkable machine but unforgiving. Its lightweight frame and fragile control surfaces made it efficient but vulnerable. When hit, it often broke apart, its fuel tanks igniting in seconds. The B-17, slower and heavier, seemed to absorb punishment in a way that defied logic. Pilots who had flown both said the difference was unmistakable. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, who commanded the famous Memphis Belle, put it plainly. The B-24 was a good airplane, but the Fortress was the one that took you home when things went bad. Ground crews said the same. The B-17 was easier to repair, its systems accessible and rugged. The Liberator's complicated fuel lines and electrical wiring required endless attention. It could carry more, but it also demanded more. Within the 8th Air Force, the two bombers operated side by side, each with a distinct role. The Liberators handled the longer missions, to Norway, Poland, and the Balkans, where range mattered most. The Fortresses took the central route, Berlin, Hamburg, Schweinfurt, Munich. The result was a partnership that blended endurance with reach. German intelligence, studying captured wreckage, came to similar conclusions. The B-24's structure was efficient but brittle. The B-17's was overbuilt by design. Its skin was thicker, its frames reinforced. To German engineers, it seemed wasteful, until they saw the photographs of B-17s returning with half their tail sections gone, or engines ripped out of their mounts still in the air. It wasn't just the Americans who compared machines. The Germans had their own heavy bomber, the Heinkel He-177, a troubled design that never lived up to its promise. In theory, it could carry a heavier load than the Fortress and fly just as far. In practice, it was a disaster. Its complex engines, two pairs coupled into 4 cylinders each, overheated and caught fire with alarming regularity. Crews called it the flaming coffin. Where the B-17 embodied simplicity and durability, the He-177 represented the opposite: complexity without reliability. That contrast revealed a deeper truth about the industrial philosophies that defined each side. The Germans built machines for performance. The Americans built machines for survival. One aimed for perfection, the other for persistence. And persistence won. Statistics told the story more clearly than propaganda ever could. In 1944, the average B-17 mission loss rate dropped below 3%, an astonishing figure considering the distances involved. A squadron could now expect to complete its required 25 missions, with most crews surviving, something that had been unthinkable a year earlier. For the Luftwaffe, the same period marked collapse. Fighter production surged, but pilots could not be trained fast enough. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. The German air defense network, once the most sophisticated in the world, began to crumble under the constant strain. The Fortress had achieved something rare in the history of warfare. It had outlasted its enemy not just through firepower, but through endurance. It had proven that reliability was a weapon as potent as any bomb or bullet. In factories back in the United States, engineers studied battle-damaged aircraft and refined the design further. The B-17G model, with its new chin turret and improved armor, was the final and most formidable variant. It represented every lesson learned from 2 years of brutal air combat. It was heavier, slower, and stronger than any before it. A machine shaped entirely by the realities of survival. Even within the Allied forces, respect for the Fortress grew. British crews who had once mocked its daylight missions now admitted admiration for the Americans' courage and for the aircraft itself. "We fly by night because we must," one RAF officer said. "They fly by day because they can." The B-17's legend spread far beyond Europe. In the Pacific, smaller numbers of fortresses fought the same kind of war, long, punishing flights over endless ocean, often returning home shot to pieces. In every theater, the pattern repeated. The Fortress endured where others fell. In the end, the comparison between bombers became almost irrelevant. Numbers, range, and payload all mattered, but none captured what made the B-17 extraordinary. It wasn't just a machine. It was an attitude made solid. The belief that strength lay not in perfection, but in the refusal to break. Every airfield in England had its own stories. Stories whispered at mess tables and passed quietly from one crew to another. Stories of bombers that had gone too far, taken too much, and somehow still come home. They weren't myths. They were facts written in twisted metal, frozen blood, and scorched aluminum. And they became the living proof that the Flying Fortress truly was what the Germans called it: the plane that wouldn't die. One of the earliest and most famous was the All-American. She belonged to the 414th Bomb Squadron, part of the 97th Bomb Group. In February 1943, during a raid over Tunisia, she collided midair with another B-17 at 15,000 feet. The impact tore her tail almost completely away. Photographs taken later showed daylight visible through the fuselage, the tail section hanging by a few strips of metal, fluttering like a flag. Every calculation said she should have fallen apart instantly, but she didn't. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, leveled the aircraft upon, ordered his men to the forward compartments, and began the long, slow flight home. The control cables were severed. The tail gunner was trapped and could not move. Yet the Fortress held together. For more than 90 minutes, she stayed in the air, trembling and creaking, but never breaking. When she finally reached base and landed, the tail section collapsed onto the runway behind her. The crew climbed out, shaking, weeping, laughing. One mechanic said later, "It was like watching a ghost land." Months later, another story would grip both sides of the war: the tale of Ye Olde Pub. In December 1943, over Bremen, a B-17 commanded by Lieutenant Charlie Brown was shredded by flak and fighters. One engine was dead, another burning. The nose was smashed, the tail riddled with holes, the radio gone. Half the crew were wounded. Somehow, the Fortress stayed airborne, limping alone toward the North Sea. A German ace, Franz Stigler of JG-27, took off to intercept the straggler. He closed in for the kill and hesitated. Through the shattered fuselage, he could see the wounded men inside. The tail gunner's guns hung limp. The bomber was defenseless. Stigler's orders were clear, but something in him rebelled. Instead of firing, he eased his throttle back, flew alongside the wounded Fortress, and saluted. Then, to the amazement of the crew inside, he escorted them out of German airspace, pointing west toward safety. Only when they reached the sea did he roll his wings, salute once more, and turn back. For decades, both men would keep the story secret. Brown, fearing court-martial for fraternizing with the enemy. Stigler, fearing punishment for letting the enemy go. 50 years later, they would meet again, embrace, and weep together. Two old men bound by a moment of grace in the middle of hell. There were countless others. Knockout Dropper hit so hard over Hanover that its engines caught fire one by one, yet landed safely on two. Wee Willie, which flew 75 missions before finally being lost in the last weeks of the war. 909, which completed 140 missions without losing a single crewman. A record almost impossible to believe. Each of these aircraft was more than an airframe. They became personalities, companions, symbols of endurance. Crews decorated them with nose art, gave them names, talked to them before takeoff. They patted the fuselage for luck, prayed to the engines, cursed at the cold metal when it wouldn't start. To the men who flew them, the B-17 was alive, and when one went down, it felt like a funeral. Crews stood in silence as ground teams marked the space on the flight line where the bomber would never return. The empty revetment, still smelling of oil and burned rubber, became a shrine. The physical evidence of these miracles of survival filled hangars and archives. Some aircraft landed with wings so shredded that engineers wondered how the airflow hadn't simply torn them off. Others came back with entire engines missing, propellers frozen solid, or tails half gone. A few had holes so large that sunlight poured through them like windows. Every time one landed, it reignited belief, not just in the machine, but in the men inside it. The Fortresses could take damage that should have been fatal, but it was the crew's willpower, their refusal to give up, that made the difference. Pilots kept crippled bombers steady for hours. Gunners kept firing with frozen hands. Medics used parachute silk to bandage wounds. A B-17 might have been built of metal, but what held it together was human courage. Even the Germans noticed it. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing bombers so damaged that they expected them to explode midair, only to watch them drift westward, steady and impossibly alive. Ground troops stared as blazing fortresses skimmed the treetops, shedding pieces of themselves but refusing to crash. There is an almost spiritual quality to those stories. They exist in that strange space between engineering and miracle, where rivets, steel, and aerodynamics meet faith. At the American bases, these crippled aircraft were sometimes given special treatment. Mechanics worked nights to repair them, not because it made sense, but because it felt wrong to let them die. They called them lucky ships, and crews begged to be assigned to them, as if some invisible force still protected them. By the end of the war, thousands of fortresses had been lost. But the memory that survived wasn't of those that fell. It was of those that came home when they shouldn't have. And in every one of those returns, you could see a reflection of something far larger than war itself. The human instinct to hold on, no matter how much has been lost, no matter how much is broken until the journey is done. By early 1945, the thunder of the Flying Fortress had become the heartbeat of the European sky. Germany, once confident in its air defenses, now lived beneath a constant shadow. The sound of engines was no longer distant or rare. It was daily, inevitable, endless. The war in the air had come full circle. 2 years earlier, Berlin had seemed untouchable. The Luftwaffe promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach the capital by daylight. Yet by February 1944, the first formations of B-17s had appeared over the city's skyline, their contrails streaking white against the winter haze. The defenders were shocked. The fortresses were not only there, they stayed. The raids on Berlin became a symbol of total air dominance. In March 1944, over 1,000 bombers and their escorts filled the sky in what was then the largest aerial assault in history. The first waves struck aircraft factories, rail yards, and power stations. The second wave came hours later, dropping their bombs through the smoke. The city burned for days. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. Fighter groups scrambled from all directions. 109s, 190s, even the experimental jet-powered Me-262s. The sky over Brandenburg became a chaotic storm of tracers, flak bursts, and vapor trails. But this time, the outcome was different. The Mustangs were there, waiting above and behind the bomber streams, cutting through German interceptors before they could reach the formations. The Luftwaffe could no longer strike without paying in blood. For the bomber crews, the missions to Berlin felt like the war's cruelest paradox. They knew that reaching the target meant they had already won, but the cost of that victory was unbearable. Each trip meant hours over hostile territory, through flak so dense that it looked like black smoke stacked in layers across the sky. At 20,000 feet, you could smell the cordite from the exploding shells, a bitter tang carried on the frozen air. The sky flickered with flashes from anti-aircraft bursts. The crews flew straight and level because deviation meant breaking formation, and breaking formation meant death. The bombs fell through cloud and smoke, vanishing into the fire below. The crews rarely saw what they hit. They saw only the glow, the orange reflection of entire city blocks burning. Some looked away. Others watched in silence, too numb for thought. Back in England, ground crews waited on the runways, scanning the horizon as the clock ticked past the expected return time. The first bombers arrived late, straggling in pairs and singles. Many had lost engines, turrets, or tails. A few came in on fire. Every landing was a small miracle. Every gap in the returning formation was a name to be written on a wall. As 1944 turned to 1945, the raids grew even larger. The flying fortresses hit industrial centers, transport hubs, and military depots deep inside the collapsing Reich. Oil refineries, tank factories, ammunition plants, each target erased another piece of Germany's ability to fight. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, the sky was already theirs. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. Its once great squadrons now flew with a handful of aircraft and barely trained pilots. Many died before they ever saw the enemy. By the final months of the war, the B-17 had become a familiar presence even to German soldiers retreating on the ground. They looked up and saw the same broad wings, the same steady flight paths, the same impassive formations stretching to the horizon. It was said that the sight of them broke morale more effectively than any weapon on the ground. One Wehrmacht officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans do not fight as men. They fight as machines. The sky belongs to them, and they use it as they please. When I see their bombers, I know the war is lost." For the crews of the flying fortresses, the sense of victory was mixed with exhaustion. They had seen too much, lost too many friends. The airfields of England, once alive with laughter and music, had grown quieter. Each mission completed felt less like triumph and more like survival. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, the flying fortresses no longer bombed. They flew food, supplies, and relief into the shattered cities they had once destroyed. Their final missions were not of war, but of mercy. The machine built to break the enemy's will ended its service, delivering hope to the same broken skies. The fortress had come full circle, from weapon to witness, from destroyer to savior. When the war ended, the skies over Europe fell silent. The contrails that once stretched from horizon to horizon faded away. Airfields that had thundered with engines and echoed with the voices of young men became quiet fields again. dotted with abandoned bombers standing motionless under the gray English rain. For the crews who survived, peace arrived like a dream that didn't feel real. After years of measuring life in missions, formations, and flak bursts, they struggled to comprehend silence. Some returned home and never spoke of what they'd seen. Others spent the rest of their lives chasing that strange mix of fear and purpose they had felt in the air. The B-17s themselves met a more practical fate. By 1945, thousands of fortresses stood idle across Europe. The war was over, but the machines of war were everywhere. They filled airfields from England to Italy, from France to North Africa. The U.S. Army Air Forces no longer needed them, and one by one, the legendary bombers were scrapped. At Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, long rows of flying fortresses were parked wing to wing across the desert floor. Workers stripped the engines, instruments, and guns, then cut the airframes into pieces. Photographs from that time show an almost surreal landscape, endless fields of aluminum glinting beneath the sun. The sound of the saws and torches replaced the roar of engines. In just a few months, nearly all of them were gone. Out of more than 12,000 built, fewer than 100 would survive. The war that had made them heroes also made them obsolete. But their legend didn't die. It only changed shape. Hollywood discovered the Flying Fortress almost immediately. In 1944, while the war still raged, Memphis Belle became a national icon, the first bomber crew to complete 25 missions and return home. Their aircraft was flown across the United States on a bond tour, its fuselage scarred with battle damage, but its name shining proudly across the nose. Crowds lined the runways to touch it, as though it carried the spirit of every crew that never came back. After the war, a handful of fortresses found second lives. Some became cargo transports, others weather research planes, and a few were sold to foreign air forces. Yet wherever they flew, they carried a certain reverence, as though their metal still remembered the cold skies of Europe. In the decades that followed, restoration efforts began. Mechanics and veterans, many now gray-haired, tracked down rusting airframes in barns, scrapyards, and forgotten corners of the world. Piece by piece, they rebuilt them. Some flew again, their engines roaring to life after decades of silence. When they lifted off, people wept. Today, only a few dozen B-17s remain airworthy. They appear at air shows, their engines echoing across fields where veterans stand with tears in their eyes. Younger generations, born long after the war, watch the massive four-engine bomber climb into the sky and feel a faint echo of what it once meant. The sight of a flying fortress in flight has become a bridge between centuries, a living reminder of the men who flew them and the endurance they embodied. Museums around the world preserve them not as machines of destruction, but as symbols of courage and sacrifice. Visitors stand beneath their wings and read the stories painted on their fuselages. Shoo Shoo Baby, 909, Memphis Belle, Sentimental Journey. Each name is a memory, each bullet hole a scar that history refused to heal. The B-17's legacy reaches beyond the battlefield. It shaped post-war aviation, influenced aircraft design, and taught a lesson that engineers still remember. Strength comes not from perfection, but from redundancy, simplicity, and faith in the human element. More than 70 years later, the Flying Fortress remains what it always was, a paradox in metal, a weapon of destruction that became a monument to endurance. A machine built for war that, in surviving, became a symbol of peace. The war that gave birth to the Flying Fortress ended long ago, but its shadow still drifts across the skies. At airfields and quiet corners of the world, you can still hear that sound, the deep, steady rhythm of four engines rising into the air. It is not the sound of war anymore. It is the sound of memory. When a surviving B-17 lifts from the runway today, people stop what they're doing. They look up. The plane climbs slowly, gracefully, its broad wings gleaming in the sunlight. It moves with the same steady determination that carried it through flak and fire 8 decades ago. The engines beat like a living heart, each pulse echoing the stories of thousands who never came home. Time has softened the edges of the legend, but it hasn't erased it. The B-17 remains one of the few machines in history that transcended its purpose. It was built to destroy, yet it came to symbolize survival. It was designed for war, but remembered for endurance. The men who flew it are almost all gone now. Their faces live on only in faded photographs. Young men in leather jackets, smiling beneath painted nose art, unaware that they were writing history one mission at a time. They didn't think of themselves as heroes, they thought of themselves as crews, doing their jobs, trusting in one another and in the machine that carried them. What the Germans called Die Festung, die nicht stirbt, the fortress that will not die, was not just a description of the aircraft. It was a reflection of the people who flew it, maintained it, and believed in it. They built a weapon that embodied their own resilience, and through it, they learned that survival, too, can be a form of victory. Even among the enemy, that truth was recognized. German fighter pilots who fought against the fortresses often admitted their grudging respect. Some said that if they had to face death in the sky, they would rather have flown in a B-17. Others confessed that when they saw a burning fortress refuse to fall, they felt something beyond fear, something like awe. The plane that wouldn't die had become a mirror for the world's endurance in its darkest hour. When you walk through a museum today and stand beneath one of these bombers, you can still feel it. The fuselage is cold to the touch, but the air around it feels alive. Light filters through the glass of the nose where a bombardier once lay staring through crosshairs at a city below. The gun turrets, still and empty now, point toward a ceiling instead of the clouds. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the engines start, the low growl building to a roar, the vibration running through the floor like the heartbeat of the past. It's impossible to stand beneath one without imagining what it must have been like: the cold, the fear, the courage, the noise, and the quiet faith that somehow the aircraft would bring them home again. History has created faster, deadlier, and more advanced bombers since. But none have ever carried the same weight of legend. None have inspired the same mixture of reverence and disbelief. Because the story of the Flying Fortress isn't really about technology at all. It's about endurance. It's about the idea that courage, discipline, and faith in each other and in what we build can hold a line against chaos itself. The B-17's engines may fall silent one day, its last flight taken, its wings finally still, but the legend it created will outlive the machine. And when future generations look back at those black and white photographs of the sky over Europe, when they see a formation of flying fortresses moving through flak and smoke, holding formation through fire and wind, they'll understand why the Germans gave it that name: the plane that burned but never broke, the machine that turned steel into faith, the aircraft that would not die, the Flying Fortress.